I walked into the home I grew up in, and realized I wasn't in a single photo. Not one. After 36 years, I finally understood. I was never the daughter they wanted, just the one they needed. What I did next, no one in my family saw it coming. I stood quietly in the narrow hallway of the house I once called home. The walls were lined with memories, but none of mine. There were photos of my sister's graduation, her wedding, the day she brought her first baby into the world. In every single frame, my parents were glowing, faces lit with unmistakable pride. But nowhere, not in a single photograph, was there a glimpse of me. Not one reminder of the life I'd built, the things I'd achieved. After 36 years, you'd think I'd be numb to it. But no, the ache still found its way into my chest. That all too familiar tightening that never really left. From the kitchen, my mother's voice cut through the silence. "Lauren, that you? Come help me with these dishes." I stood still. I hadn't come here to wash plates. I came to set boundaries. To finally say the things I'd swallowed for far too long. When I walked into the kitchen, she was moving quickly, arranging a tray of appetizers. It was for Margaret, of course. My younger sister had just landed a promotion, department manager at a local bank. A role she didn't exactly earn, but rather received, courtesy of Dad's connections. "Can you finish these? I need to go get change," she said, already walking away. "She doesn't like plain crackers." She tossed over her shoulder. "Your father got the wrong kind again. Margaret prefers sesame." I nodded, biting my tongue, sliding into her spot at the counter. Same routine, different day. My phone buzzed. A message from Sharon, my ex-sister-in-law, and the only person who's really stood by me these last few years. "Did you tell them yet?" I hadn't. How do you even begin that conversation? How do you tell the people who gave you life that you're done financially supporting them? Done being their silent benefactor? Done pretending? And how do you explain that your only child recently filled out a family tree at school, and left their names off completely? The front door slammed. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. "Lauren," my father greeted without even looking at me. "Where's your mother?" "Margaret will be here soon. She's getting dressed," I replied. He nodded once and disappeared into the living room without another word. I stood there, stacking crackers on a tray, in the very kitchen where I had begged, quietly, in my own heart, for decades to just be seen. The full ride to NYU? The promotion to senior analyst? The birth of my son? All brushed aside like background noise. Meanwhile, Margaret was the golden one. The miracle baby they thought they'd never have after years of miscarriages. I was the first draft, the child they didn't know how to love properly. When my husband walked out on me 3 years ago for someone he met at work, I thought surely this would be the moment they'd show up. Their daughter, suddenly a single mom, would finally get their support, their concern. Instead, they asked if I had been too focused on my career, if maybe I hadn't been wife enough. It wasn't them who showed up. It was Justin's parents, Sharon and Brian, who stepped in. They picked up Mark from school, kept him on weekends when I had to travel for work. They treated him like their own. My parents? Too busy. Always. Until 6 months ago. Suddenly, the calls came weekly. Sunday dinners were back. They offered to babysit, to help out. I wanted to believe it meant something. That maybe, just maybe, they had realized what they'd missed. But then Margaret got promoted. And suddenly, everything made sense. They didn't come back for love. They came back for money. No more silence. My mother re-entered the kitchen, now dressed in a fresh blouse. One I had paid for, of course. "Did you finish the appetizers?" she asked, her voice brisk. "Margaret will be here any minute." I gave a small nod and slid the tray toward her. "We need to talk," I said quietly, my hands steady despite the storm building inside me. Her face changed instantly. The false cheerfulness evaporated, replaced by something tight and wary. "About what? Can it wait until after the celebration?" It could, but it wouldn't. "I'm done," I said, calmly. "No more financial support." She blinked. "What financial support?" As if we hadn't had this silent arrangement for years. As if I hadn't been paying their car loan, their roof repair, their property taxes. As if I hadn't covered the vacation to Hawaii 2 summers ago. The new washer and dryer. The credit card bills they never even attempted to manage. I took a slow breath and looked her in the eyes. The car, the credit cards, the house insurance, all of it. "I'm done." She stood frozen, like I had just spoken a language she didn't understand. "But why would you do that? After everything we've done for you?" I couldn't help it. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Everything you've done for me? We raised you. We gave you food, a roof, the bare minimum." I snapped. Her eyes flared, indignant. "When Justin left, who helped me raise Mark? Who picked him up from after-school care when I was working overtime? When he was sick and needed to be taken to his follow-up appointments, where were you?" She said nothing, just stared. When I got promoted, who acknowledged it? Who said they were proud? Not you. Not once. The air shifted. My father stepped into the doorway. Arms crossed. Brow furrowed. "What's going on here?" he asked. His voice sharp. "She's cutting us off financially." My mother burst out. "After everything we've done for her." He looked at me, his face darkening. "Is this about that situation?" "We already explained." "No." I cut him off. "It's not just about that night. It's about all of it. The dam broke. It's about Mark calling Sharon grandma because she actually treats him like one. It's about you skipping his birthday to take Margaret to her lake house. It's about me being rushed into emergency surgery and you refusing to pick up your own grandson because Margaret had a dinner." Their expressions didn't change, not a flicker of remorse. Only annoyance, defensiveness. "3 weeks ago," I said, voice trembling. I was doubled over in pain. "They rushed me to the ER. I could barely form sentences. My first call was to you." I looked at them both, daring them to deny it. "And do you remember what you said?" My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father's jaw clenched. "You were at Margaret's promotion dinner. Can't his father get him?" you asked. Justin was in Seattle, with his new wife. He was unreachable. And when I told you I was going into surgery, you said you couldn't leave because, what was it again? Oh right, Margaret would be devastated. My voice cracked slightly. And then, you called Mark a burden. My child, their grandson, a burden. It was Sharon who answered that night. It was Sharon who dropped everything, picked up Mark, brought him to the hospital, and stayed with me overnight. She pulled chairs together so he could sleep. She held my hand while I came out of anesthesia. That was the night I understood what love actually looked like. Not obligation, not blood, but choice. Real family. Enough. My father's voice dragged me back to the kitchen. "You're overreacting," he said flatly. "We couldn't just leave Margaret's dinner. You know how important that night was for her." I stared at him, stunned. "More important than your grandson being left alone at school? More important than your daughter being rushed into surgery?" I exhaled, slow and certain. "I'm done." There was no yelling, no drama, just a quiet, resolute calm that had taken me years to find. "No more payments. No more pretending this is okay. You don't get to use me when it's convenient. Then forget I exist when I need you." My mother's expression crumpled, not with guilt, but calculation. She leaned forward, voice hushed. "The car payment is due in a few days. And your father's medication." Manipulation, wrapped in concern, but it didn't move me this time. "Margaret's salary should be more than enough," I said simply. "Or maybe you can dip into those retirement savings you've been guarding like treasure. I'm not your safety net anymore." The front door opened behind us. Margaret's voice rang out like a chime, cheerful, unbothered. "Mom, Dad, I brought champagne." That was my cue. I grabbed my purse from the counter. "Ready to go." "Lauren, wait," my mother called out, panic seeping into her voice. "You can't do this to us." But I could. And I was. I walked down the hallway past Margaret, who was just setting down her coat, eyes wide with confusion. "Lauren, I didn't know you were coming to my celebration." "I wasn't," I said softly. "I just came to say goodbye." There was no venom in my voice. No drama, just finality. "Congratulations on the promotion," I added. And I meant it. Margaret was never the problem. Not really. The real problem was the way our parents only had room in their hearts for one daughter, and I was never her. Margaret looked thrown off, unsure of what to say. "Appreciate it," she said after a beat. "You heading out already?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Let them explain it. Let them piece together the wreckage of the house they built on favoritism and silence. I stepped outside into the cool air, the weight of years clinging to my shoulders, but already, I could feel it loosening. On the drive home, the quiet wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I wasn't crying from grief. I was breathing in relief. For the first time in decades, I wasn't chasing their love. I wasn't clawing for scraps of attention. I wasn't begging to be chosen. I was free. When I pulled into Sharon's driveway, I checked my phone. She'd sent pictures. Mark standing at the kitchen counter, covered in flour, helping her bake cookies. His face was lit up in pure joy, eyes crinkled with laughter. Every image radiated something I'd spent a lifetime longing for. Love, simple, effortless, and real. Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who shows up. The call. 3 months passed. No phone calls. No guilt-laced messages. Just silence. And honestly, it was the most peaceful silence I'd ever known. Then, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in weeks, Mom. I stared at it. My thumb hovered over the decline button. I almost let it ring out. But curiosity got the better of me. "Lauren," she said, stiffly, as if each word had been pre-approved. "We need to talk about this situation. Situation." That's what she called it now. Not neglect, not betrayal, not the years of conditional love. Just a situation, meaning, of course, the financial mess they were in without me footing the bill. There's nothing left to discuss, I said calmly. A beat of silence. Then came the bitterness in her voice. Margaret refuses to help us. Says we need to figure it out ourselves. I almost laughed. The golden child, their prize, their pride, now drawing the same boundary I had. The car got taken yesterday, she said next, her tone sharp, desperate. And the mortgage, it's 2 months overdue. I paused, felt a flicker of something, maybe old reflexes of guilt. That deep conditioning that said I was responsible for their comfort, for their stability, for their peace. But I wasn't. Not anymore. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it, but only just a little. You can't just leave us like this. She snapped. We're your parents. You're my biological parents, I said, but you were never my emotional support. You were never the people I could rely on when it counted. I had to go. Mark has soccer practice. Lauren, don't. I ended the call. Then I blocked the number. Across the kitchen, Mark was sitting cross-legged on the floor. Crayons spread out around him. Working on a school project. A family tree. I leaned over his shoulder gently. How's it going, kiddo? He grinned. Proud. Almost done. At the top of the tree, in careful handwriting, he'd written, Grandma Sharon, and Grandpa Brian. Beneath that, he'd placed, Mom, and Dad, me and Justin. And at the very bottom, his own name, written in bold letters. There were no branches for Margaret. No lines for my parents. This everyone in our family? I asked softly. He nodded. Certain. These are the ones who love us. That was it. So simple. So true. So clear. Later that night, after he'd fallen asleep, I sat out on the back porch with a glass of wine. The breeze was cool, brushing against my skin like a gentle reminder that things were different now. And I thought about inheritance. Not money, not property, but the emotional kind, the beliefs we pass down, the lessons we absorb about love, worth, and what family really means. My parents had passed on a broken version, one rooted in transaction, control, guilt, but the cycle stops with me. Mark will inherit something better, stronger, truer. He will grow up knowing that love isn't something you earn. It's something you're given, freely, fully, without condition. Rewriting legacy. That weekend, my phone vibrated with a message from Sharon. Brian's making his famous chili sundae. You and Mark coming? I smiled before I even finished reading the sentence. Wouldn't miss it, I replied. This was my legacy now. Not guilt, not obligation, but choice, connection, love that came without strings attached. For the first time in my life, I felt full, not in the material sense, but full of what actually mattered. Looking back now, I can see it clearly, the pattern that repeated for years like a loop I couldn't escape. The chasing, the performing, the constant hunger to be noticed. I remember the walls of my childhood bedroom, lined with spelling bee certificates, math trophies, ribbons from science fairs, all collecting dust. Meanwhile, my parents were front-row regulars at Margaret's soccer games, her tap recitals, even her average grade report card nights. When I got accepted to NYU on a full ride, my father barely looked up from the dinner table. New York? He muttered. That's too far. And who's supposed to help your mother around the house? Margaret? No, not Margaret. Never Margaret. She was too delicate, too adored. I left anyway. I worked my way through college. Through grad school, I built a career from scratch. With no safety nets. Became a finance director. Bought a house. I stopped needing anyone, especially them. Then I met Josh. Charismatic, brilliant, the kind of man who made you feel like the only person in the room. His parents, Sharon and Brian, welcomed me instantly. Holiday dinners where I was asked about my dreams. Backyard barbecues where I laughed without feeling like a stranger. It was all so foreign. So easy. So safe. Sharon called just to check in. Brian taught me how to change a tire without making me feel stupid. When Josh proposed, I was glowing. My parents found fault with everything. The venue, the flowers, the date, even the dress I wore. Margaret, my maid of honor, looked bored the entire ceremony. They left the reception early, saying Margaret had an early dentist appointment. But Sharon and Brian stayed, helped clean up, held me in the final hug of the night, like I was already part of their family. When Mark was born, everything should have changed. He was their first grandchild. My parents visited once, stayed 20 minutes. My mother barely held him. And when she finally did, all she said was, "He looks like Josh," as if that excused the detachment in her eyes. Sharon and Brian, though, they were there, with casseroles, extra blankets, willing hands and warm hearts. They offered to sleep over those first few weeks just so I could shower, eat, breathe. Then Josh left. A text message. That was it. No apology. No explanation. I was shattered, curled up on the bathroom floor, choking on tears and silence. It was Sharon who found me. Sharon who packed a bag for Mark. Sharon who took us in. Their son had broken me, but they refused to let me break alone. My parents? One phone call. My mother's voice was laced with something almost smug. Men don't appreciate women who focus too much on their careers. I warned you. Not support. Not empathy. Just blame. But Sharon and Brian, they stayed. They said the words I never thought I'd hear. You're still family. The cost of being needed. In the months after Josh left, everything began to unravel. Court dates, legal fees, daycare bills, full-time work stacked on single motherhood. It was like trying to juggle knives in a storm. Eventually, I caved. I called them my parents. Just until things leveled out. Just a little help. My father wrote a check. Small, cold. Don't expect this to be a habit, he said, sliding it across the table like I was a stranger asking for a loan. But when their car broke down the following month, they called me immediately. Can you cover this? Just this once. Until we're back on our feet. That once became a dozen. Then 2 dozen. I paid off their overdue property taxes. I cleared their credit card debt twice. I took care of their roof, their car, their new appliances, even their trip to Maui. Every time, I told myself, maybe this time they'll finally see me. Maybe this will be the moment they're proud, grateful, different. But it never came. They just expected it. And I let it happen. Because somewhere, deep in the shadows of my heart, I still clung to that aching little voice that whispered, if you just give enough, sacrifice enough, they'll finally love you like they love Margaret. Pathetic? Maybe. But when you've spent your whole life starving for approval, even crumbs feel like a feast. And that's the trap. They didn't love me. They needed me. And I mistook the two. That is, until the breaking point. Until I heard those words. He's such a burden. Mark, my son, my heartbeat walking outside my body. Their grandson. A burden. I heard it through the haze of pain in that hospital bed. I just had emergency surgery. I could barely form a sentence. But those words cut through the fog like ice. That was the fracture. The clean break. I finally saw it for what it was, not love. Not care. Not family. Just a transaction. And I had been the ATM. I remember lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, wondering how I got there, physically, emotionally, financially. It hit me all at once. I was financing their lifestyle. And in return, I got nothing, not even kindness. They hoarded their retirement funds while I drained mine to keep them afloat. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't offer to help with Mark. They didn't celebrate my wins or hold me through my losses. They just took. And I let them. But that ended in that kitchen, on the day Margaret brought champagne. And I brought closure. That was the day I remembered. I don't owe anyone my peace. Especially not people who treat me like a resource. Not a daughter. That realization shattered something in me. But from the pieces, I began to rebuild. And for the first time, the foundation was mine. Not guilt. Not approval. Just truth. The sister's call. A week after I walked out of our parents' house. My phone rang. Margaret's name lit up the screen. We rarely spoke, maybe twice a year. Our conversations were always polite, rehearsed, and distant, like two people cast in a play neither of us had auditioned for. I hesitated, then answered, "What did you say to Mom and Dad?" Her voice was sharp, like I had damaged something precious. "They're spiraling over money," she added, her tone accusatory. I stayed quiet for a second before answering. I told them the truth. No more financial aid, no more playing the role they scripted for me. Her silence on the other end stretched longer than I expected. "They think you're being cruel," she said eventually. "That this is revenge." Was it cruel? Was it cruel to finally stop bleeding so they could thrive? Was it revenge to hold people accountable for emotional starvation? "I'm not punishing them," I said plainly. "I'm just done pretending." Another pause. Then came something I hadn't heard in years, honesty. "They're never going to change. You know," she said. Her voice was softer now. Less defensive. "They've always been like this." There it was. A quiet admission we'd both tiptoed around our entire lives. They had their minds made up before we were even old enough to speak. I replied, "You were the miracle. I was the obligation." Another silence. Then, surprisingly, "Good for you." 2 small words. But they landed like a thunderclap. And for a brief second, we weren't rivals, weren't the golden child and the forgotten one. We were just 2 daughters trying to survive the same warped version of love. After we hung up, I sat with that conversation longer than I expected. I wondered if Margaret had ever felt the weight of being their favorite. Maybe it wasn't freedom, it was just a different kind of cage. Expectation instead of invisibility. It didn't erase what had happened between us. It didn't undo her silence, her complicity, but it made her human again. We were both handed roles we never auditioned for. Hers came with a spotlight, mine with shadows, but neither of us ever got to write our own script. Until now. Months passed, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't drained. I wasn't scanning texts from my parents, calculating how much I could give without completely erasing myself. I was finally understanding what real freedom looked like, not just freedom from responsibility, but freedom from the endless hunger for their approval. My worth no longer lived in their voices. I didn't need their recognition. I didn't need their applause. I had me. I had Mark. I had Sharon and Brian. I had peace. And I had earned every inch of it. Love without conditions. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Mark came bursting into the kitchen, all energy and sunlight, his sneakers squeaking against the floor. "Mom," he said, eyes lit up, "Grandma Sharon says she's making spaghetti tonight. Can we go now?" Grandma Sharon, a title not earned by blood, but by presence, by kindness, by every late-night phone call, every ride to practice, every whispered story at bedtime. "Of course, buddy," I smiled. "Grab your shoes." As he darted down the hall, a strange feeling settled in my chest. Something warm, steady, familiar. Gratitude. For this bright, resilient child who had never asked for anything more than love, and had finally begun to receive it. For this unconventional family we had built. One forged not from obligation, but from choice. I looked around our small, cozy kitchen, the fridge covered in Mark's drawings. Number 1 mom mug on the counter from last Christmas. Sharon's homemade peach jam lined up in neat rows. This was home. This was ours. Not something passed down, but something we'd created from scratch. And then it hit me, how far I'd come. Once, I had begged for love like it was a currency I hadn't yet earned. I'd measured my value in applause I never received. I had twisted myself into shapes I didn't recognize just to be enough for people who couldn't see me. But now I knew the truth. I had always been enough. They just weren't capable of seeing it. That evening, I sat on Sharon and Brian's back porch, a warm plate of spaghetti in my lap, Mark laughing in the yard with their dog. Sharon brought out a glass of wine and sat beside me. "Looks like someone's having the time of his life," she said, nodding toward Mark. "He is," I said. "We both are." She reached over and gently squeezed my hand. "You're doing good, Lauren, you're doing really good." And I believed her. For the first time in my life, I believed it. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was healing, reclaiming, choosing. Later that night, after Mark had fallen asleep, his cheeks still sticky from chocolate pudding, I sat outside on my own back porch. The stars blinked gently overhead. The breeze whispered through the trees. And I thought about inheritance. Not in the legal sense, but the emotional kind. My parents had inherited pain, and they passed it on like a family heirloom. Conditional love, performative affection, pride given only when earned, then withheld the moment you needed it most. But that chain ends with me. Mark will inherit something else. He'll grow up knowing that family isn't a duty. It's not something that traps you in guilt or silence. It's the people who show up, who love you not for what you do, but simply because you exist. He'll know that his worth doesn't have to be proven, that his voice matters, that he is seen, and in giving that to him, I finally gave it to myself. Freedom, peace, love, unconditional. The ending I wrote myself. As I sat beneath the stars, wine glass in hand, I realized something I'd never said out loud, something that sat quietly beneath all the years. All the silence, all the pain. I was never broken. I was simply born into a family that didn't know how to hold someone like me. All those years, I had confused their absence with my inadequacy. I thought if I just achieved more, gave more, bent more, they'd see me. Finally. But no amount of giving could fill a well that deep with cracks. Their love had always come with terms. Be quiet, be useful, be invisible, unless we need you. And I had done it. I had played the part, worn the costume, hit my marks, until I couldn't anymore. And that decision, to stop performing, wasn't selfish. It was sacred. That night, I walked into Mark's room. He was fast asleep, curled around his favorite stuffed dinosaur, his breathing soft and steady. I knelt beside his bed and brushed the hair off his forehead. "You will never have to earn love," I whispered. I didn't care that he couldn't hear me. I needed to say it. To speak the words I'd spent my whole life waiting for someone to say to me. "You are loved, without condition, without performance, without proving. You are loved, period." I walked back into the hallway, past the photo frames on our wall. This time, they weren't reminders of what I lacked. They were evidence of everything I had built. Mark's first day of school, His muddy soccer cleats after winning a game. Sharon and Brian holding him with the kind of pride I used to beg for. A family that chose each other. A life that wasn't inherited, it was created. One act of love at a time. My phone buzzed on the counter. Another message from Sharon. Thinking of taking Mark apple picking next weekend. You in? I smiled as I typed back, always. This was my inheritance now. Not wounds, not warped expectations, not trauma dressed as tradition, but healing, the kind you pass down, the kind you build, not by being perfect, but by being present. I will never again mistake usefulness for love. I will never again call loyalty what was really manipulation. I will never again shrink myself to be accepted. Because now, I know better. I am no longer the forgotten daughter. I am no longer the backup plan. I am no longer their silent benefactor. I am free. And my son? He will grow up knowing exactly what that means. That family is not defined by blood, but by presence. That love isn't earned, it's lived. And that sometimes, the most powerful legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you refuse to pass on. The legacy I choose. It's strange, the way peace arrives. Not with fireworks, not with dramatic closure, but quietly. One ordinary morning, I stood in the kitchen, brewing coffee, watching Mark draw at the table. He was sketching another family tree, this time for a new school project. But he wasn't just drawing lines between names. He was drawing hearts, laughter, moments. He looked up and asked, "Mom, should I put Sharon and Brian in the big branches at the top?" I smiled. Absolutely. Because they weren't just in our lives, they rooted us. And then, as if reading my thoughts, he said, "I like our family." Simple words, but they hit me like a prayer. I like our family. Not tolerate, not obligated to, not surviving within. He liked it, because it was soft, safe, chosen. And in that moment, I knew with total clarity. This is what breaking the cycle looks like. Not perfection, not pretending pain never happened, but choosing differently, lovingly, deliberately. I used to think legacy was something written in stone. Now, I know better. Legacy is the love you teach. The wounds you choose not to pass down. The moments when you say, "This ends with me." So if anyone ever asks me how I finally let go of the people who never truly saw me, I'll say this. I stopped waiting to be chosen. And I started choosing myself. I stopped begging to belong. And I built a place where I do. I stopped handing out pieces of my soul in exchange for crumbs. And I sat down at a table where love was already being served. Not because I earned it, but because I finally believed I was worthy of it. And in this house, in this life we've built, that's the only kind of love that stays. And if you're listening to this, if your heart feels heavy because it knows what it's like to be the forgotten one, the overgiver, the unchosen child, I want you to know something. You're not alone. And more importantly, you were never the problem. Your light didn't go unnoticed, it just wasn't recognized by the wrong people. And that doesn't mean it's any less brilliant. You don't have to keep proving your worth to those who refuse to see it. You don't have to keep showing up for people who only remember you when they need something. You get to choose your peace. You get to write your own ending. You get to build a family, a life, a legacy that feels like home. Not because it's perfect, but because it's yours. And maybe, just maybe, this is the moment where your healing begins. Right here, right now. Because sometimes, the most radical thing we can do is finally believe that we are enough, without needing anyone else to say it first. For the one who needed to hear this story wasn't just about a daughter, or a mother, or a broken family tree. It was about you, me, all of us, the ones who gave too much, who stayed too long, who tried so hard to be enough for people who had already made up their minds. But the truth is, you don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your peace. You don't have to keep burning just to keep other people warm. The love you're looking for? It exists. And it starts with you. With how gently you hold your own heart. With how fiercely you protect your joy. With how bravely you walk away from anything that asks you to become less. So if this story stirred something in you, if it felt like a mirror instead of a tale, then maybe this was your reminder. You don't need to earn what should be freely given. Love, respect, belonging. You already deserve all of it. No more proving. No more shrinking. No more waiting for someone to finally choose you. Because from this moment on, you choose you. And that's the beginning of everything. To the ones finding their way. To the ones walking away from people they love. To the ones setting boundaries no one ever taught them how to set. To the ones rebuilding from the ruins of someone else's silence. You are not weak for finally choosing yourself. You are not heartless for walking away. You are not broken for craving peace more than proximity. Some families are built by blood. Others are built by presence. By effort. By choice. You don't need to carry the legacy of pain just because someone handed it to you. You can stop it, break it, rewrite it, and you already are. So take the love you never got and pour it into the people who stayed, into the children you're raising differently, into the version of yourself that finally knows her worth. You don't have to explain your healing to anyone who caused the wound. You don't have to apologize for the peace that came after the goodbye. This is your story now, and it's more beautiful than anything they could have written for you. So go ahead, close that chapter, lock the door behind you, and step fully into the life you were always meant to live. Loved, whole, and finally, free. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more real-life family dramas. Let me know in the comments what you think about today's story. Was it fair or totally messed up? See you in the next one.